Reframing Human Rights Talk, an Empathy-Based Approach by Trisha Bravi and Cassie Scott. In this presentation, we address the center of the debate surrounding human rights talk. Frequently cited as groundless and ethnocentric, human rights talk currently proves ineffective. We reframe human rights talk as a discourse grounded in empathy to get around these concerns and current problems with the application of rights talk as it is currently understood.
Our approach to human rights recognizes the humanity in everyone, even those lacking certain capacities and belonging to different cultures. So what do we mean when we say human rights talk? In a philosophy course with Professor Howard Pickett on poverty, dignity, and human rights, we have defined rights talk as moral or legal claims one can legitimately make by virtue of being human. These claims operate under the warrant that humans matter and deserve to be treated as subjects rather than objects. So why the confusion? What is the debate around rights talk?
There's been much confusion revolving around human rights talk. Frequently asked questions include, what, if anything, grounds human rights? And is human rights talk ethnocentric?
In response to the first question, Kant claims that human rights are grounded in dignity, and he believes dignity requires the capacity for rational agency, or the ability to set ends for oneself. Unlike Kant, Walterstorff argues that human rights are grounded in the love bestowed upon all humans by God, while Vey states that what is sacred in man is not the personality, but the impersonal. Rorty goes against each of these thinkers and claims that human rights are groundless, because we cannot know what man is and what defines our shared humanity.
In response to the question, is human rights talk ethnocentric? Atkinson says yes. She uses a short story to show that individual cultural values are not always universal, and that the West often imposes its particular conception of the good onto other cultures with documents like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Mutual says human rights talk is hypocritical and ironic because, in the discussion, the West almost never talks about its human rights violations. Thus, human rights talk is culturally imperialistic and ethnocentric. But others push back against the ethnocentric claim. Sen argues that no culture is monolithic, so cultures cannot be viewed as singular units, and different cultures have overlapping values. Little, Sachedina, and Kelsey expand upon this argument. They point to differing religions and demonstrate that foundational values of varying groups, like Muslims and Christians, are not always in conflict. Needless to say, there has been quite a bit of discussion and confusion surrounding human rights.
We stop now to ask what is driving human rights abuses to better understand why rights talk matters. In our point of view, human rights abuses or violations occur when the human places himself above or below another. In other words, human rights abuses occur when people fail to see each other as equals. If I think I am superior to you, therefore making you undeserving of my attention and love, I deny your humanity by refusing to give you love. If I think I am inferior to you, therefore making myself undeserving of your attention and love, I deny my humanity by failing to accept your love.
Thus, we define human rights violations as actions and inactions committed to either the self or another human which result when we reject our humanity or the humanity of another. Put simply, human rights violations most frequently occur in the absence of empathy.
Empathy, then, is important to ensuring the equal treatment of all humans. The need for empathy seems to be a source of overlapping consensus among scholars like Rorty, Kant, and Dworkin. Rorty makes the most explicit reference to the need for empathy. He asks that we use stories to step into the shoes of another. Rorty focuses on commonalities between humans. The question for Rorty is, how are we similar, not how do we differ? According to Rorty, it is more efficient to put foundationalism behind us and create an inclusive moral community rather than worry about what grounds human rights. By grounding human rights in empathy, we create an inclusive moral community. Even Kant, the secularist, makes a call for empathy. His definition of dignity requires moral capability, or the ability to have regard for others. We often call this respect. Dworkin grounds human rights in, quote, empathy or the communion we have with every other creature who faces the same frightening challenge, end quote. The same frightening challenge is better known as life. If the scholars do not mention a need for empathy directly, they do indirectly by expressing their concerns about rights talk. Here we show that their concerns about rights talk stem from a lack of empathy. For example, Mutual worries that the way we talk about human rights abuses in the form of the savages, victims, and saviors metaphor dehumanizes the savages. As for Walterstorff, he worries about what the world would look like if ruled by Kantians. If human rights are grounded in the capacity for rational agency as Kant suggests, then we leave the anencephalic child and patient with Alzheimer's out of the conversation. Grounding human rights in empathy solves these dilemmas. Empathy allows me to recognize the humanity in the savage, the anencephalic child, and the patient with Alzheimer's.
In class, we have expressed other worries. We found ourselves asking, what about trees? What about animals? What about the patient with Alzheimer's and the anencephalic child? If we ground human rights talk, or some version of it, in empathy, then we get around this difficult question of who counts. You can feel empathy for a tree, an animal, a dead relative, and even a fictional character in a book. Thus, we define empathy as the ability to see the world from someone else's perspective, to be non-judgmental, to understand another's feelings, and to communicate that understanding to the other person.
By grounding human rights in empathy, we also get around the claim that rights talk is ethnocentric. I am not imposing my conception of the good life if I aim to see the world from someone else's perspective, if I aim to be non-judgmental, if I aim to understand another's feelings, and if I aim to communicate that understanding on the other person's behalf after listening to their story. As Vey reminds us, affliction is by its nature inarticulate. Our empathy-based approach to human rights puts the onus on the other human to listen for a cry.
By placing the onus on the other human to listen, some may worry. But this would be needless worrying. Most of us have the capacity for empathy, and if someone lacks this capacity, we ought to scratch our heads and ask why. Maybe the individual lacks the security and sympathy to relax long enough to listen, as Rorty tells us. The problem then is not with the individual, but with the situation, social structure, or culture in which he or she was raised. The question now becomes, how do we cultivate empathy?
Our response is, cultivate empathy however you want. Use religion, conversations, even stories. There is no right way. For scholars, the debate centers around which method is most effective and inclusive. Rorty feels stories and conversations are the best models for cultivating empathy, while Walterstorff finds religion to be the best model for teaching humans about how relationships ought to be. According to Walterstorff, God is love, God loves all, and therefore religion is the most inclusive discourse in his point of view. Vey seems to agree with Walterstorff that religion is the best model we have, but she does not immediately reject rights talk. Instead, she asserts, at a minimum, two things rights talk will require to be effective. 1. Public education and rights talk, or human rights education to encourage such forms of free expression, and 2. Politicians who can hear the cry of injustice. From experience, we know that these two conditions are not currently met. So Vey wants to replace rights talk with religion on grounds similar to Walterstorff's. While we do not make the case for secular arguments because we do not find secular arguments as moving, you can still use these arguments if they treat the self and others as subjects rather than objects.
The point here is that any discourse can be used in a hypocritical way. There are hypocritical Catholics and hypocritical human rights activists who say one thing and believe or do another. To prevent the misuse of such language, we advocate for the application of an additional framework to test the morality of your chosen discourse. To check the morality of your chosen discourse, apply the 10 features of objectification. The purpose of rights talk is to avoid treating the human as an object. Here is what to avoid according to Martha Nussbaum and Ray Langton.
1. Instrumentality. Nussbaum defines instrumentality as the treatment of a person as a tool for the objectifier's purposes. Kant agrees with Nussbaum that we ought not treat the person as a tool. Kant's categorical imperative requires that we treat the human as an end in himself, not as a mere means. That's not to say we cannot work with people to achieve our ends, but we must not exploit individuals to accomplish our ends.
2. Denial of autonomy. Nussbaum defines the denial of autonomy as the treatment of a person as lacking in autonomy and self-determination. Again, Kant agrees with Nussbaum. He says we ought to treat people as end-setters. We argue, however, that the recognition of autonomy leaves some folks out of the conversation. So, here we apply Jung's concept of self-determination as relational autonomy. According to Jung, an adequate conception of autonomy should promote the capacity of individuals to pursue their own ends in the context of relationships in which others may do the same. We refer to this as relational autonomy, in which I respect my own ends as worthy of pursuing, but I also take into account the ends of those with whom I come into contact, and even those with whom I do not.
3. Inertness. Nussbaum defines inertness as the treatment of a person as lacking in agency and perhaps also inactivity. This feature addresses Walterstorff's worry that Kant leaves a bunch of people out of the conversation if he grounds human rights in the capacity for rational agency.
4. Fungibility. Nussbaum defines fungibility as the treatment of a person as interchangeable with other objects. Kant agrees that humanity's value is beyond price. From Kant's view, human beings have an intrinsic worth, i.e. dignity, which makes them valuable above all price. Moreover, humans have incomparable worth, so there is nothing for which you could replace or trade them.
5. Violability. Nussbaum defines violability as the treatment of a person as lacking in boundary integrity. To treat the person as lacking in boundary integrity goes against one of Nussbaum's 10 central capabilities, bodily integrity. She says that humans should be, quote, able to move freely from place to place, to be secure against violent assault, including sexual assault and domestic violence, end quote.
6. Ownership. Nussbaum defines ownership as the treatment of a person as something that is owned by another or can be bought and sold. Again, Kant would say that treating the person in this way treats them as a mere means and overlooks that humanity has a value beyond price.
7. Denial of subjectivity. Nussbaum defines the denial of subjectivity as the treatment of a person as something whose experiences and feelings, if any, need not be taken into account. Political philosopher Iris Marion Young's understanding of the individual person as constituted through communicative and interactive relations with others who both constrain and enable her requires that we treat others as subjects whose preferences also matter. According to Raw's principle of public reason, we need not satisfy those preferences, but we must allow each person a seat at the table to express those preferences.
8. Reduction to body. Langton defines reduction to the body as the treatment of a person as identified with their body or body parts. Reduction to the body is one problem Vey tries to avoid by grounding the sacred in the impersonal rather than the personality. When focusing on the impersonal, there is nothing specific about the body that defines one's worth.
9. Reduction to appearance. Langton defines reduction to appearance as the treatment of a person primarily in terms of how they look or how they appear to the senses. By requiring that your human rights model or discourse not reduce the human to appearance alone, we avoid claims that rights talk is ethnocentric. To focus on differences based on race, for example, would be to treat you as an object. 10. Silencing. Langton defines silencing as the treatment of a person as if they are silent, lacking the capacity to speak. Both Vey and Young emphasize the importance of listening to all voices, especially minority voices. According to Vey, quote, affliction is by its nature inarticulate, end quote, and, quote, The privileged have a monopoly on language, end quote.
We put the 10 features of objectification and communication with other scholars to show that many of their good points are kept and many of their worries are addressed by applying this test to any framework, be it rights talk, religion, or stories. Any discourse you use must not treat another human as an object rather than a subject. The presence of any of these 10 features suggests that the human is being objectified. Now we wonder, how would our world look different if we applied this new approach?
If we applied our new approach, we would see the world differently. We would see both severe poverty and extreme wealth as human rights violations. Both overlook a person's humanity. Kant agrees. He says that deprivation and excess are equally bad because both situations overlook duties to the self and duties to other beings. Both severe poverty and extreme wealth treat human beings as mere means by focusing too narrowly on material objects and, quote, subjugating oneself to the goods, end quote. The person living in severe poverty focuses too much on what she does not have, while the person living in extreme wealth becomes obsessed with what she does have. An application of the 10 features of objectification test would reveal that both situations are immoral. The person living in severe poverty is treated as an object when the body's needs are unmet as a result of circumstance, not choice. And the person living in extreme wealth is treated as an object when they associate themselves more closely with their objects than their humanity. This is defined as the feature of fungibility. In conclusion, if we applied an empathy-based approach to human rights, we would expect to see a reduction in human rights violations and an increase in inclusive social and political structures.